Welcome to the AP World Student Podcast. It's your host, Cameron, and today we're talking about terrorism. Recently in Manchester, there was a suicide bombing, prompting me to think more about this issue. Besides Trump, the news we hear the most about is recent acts of terrorism. The dictionary definition of a terrorist is a person who uses unlawful violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. While it's true that terrorist organizations are antagonists that pose a threat to civilian populations, most of us are probably unaware of the basis and foundations of these organizations' goals and ideologies. Since it's important to talk about the specifics of these organizations in order to ease global tension, I am joined by Aaliyah, Andrew, and Anna for discussion. What do you guys think about the many different terrorist groups?
I feel like there is a false idea that most terrorists are Islamic extremists. While many groups often heard about in the news are groups that practice Islam, a terrorist group does not have to be Muslim.
People most likely hear the most about ISIS. That probably helps enforce that stereotype.
Yeah, but there are a whole bunch of other terrorist groups.
Like what?
Well, there's a terrorist group that has been around since the 1960s called the ETA. The ETA operates mainly in Spain, but also in parts of France. They have killed many people and caused panic and chaos throughout Spain. A lot of the times, people think that terrorism occurs mainly in third world countries or in the Middle East, but there are actually a decent amount of terrorist organizations who operate all over the world.
Wow, didn't know about them. Are there any other groups you know about?
Well, there's a man named Shamil Basayev who is the ringleader of the Chechen separatist movement in Russia. The Chechens are a Muslim minority living in Russia's North Caucasus region and are a group that have resisted Russian rule for over 200 years due to their belief that their religion and ethnicity sets them apart from Russia. Basayev has led the Chechen separatist movement and has been the mastermind behind many of the most violent terrorist attacks in Russia. In fact, the Beslan school hostage crisis is considered the worst terrorist attack in history.
What are the goals of these groups?
ISIS wants to create an Islamic state, but extremely fundamentalist.
The ETA wants to establish a Basque state in the northern side of Spain. They want to create a socialist Basque state partially because of nationalism. They think that they are unique people speaking their own language and have their own unique culture. Throughout their years, they have targeted some high-profile people like their assassination of Admiral Luis Carrero Blanco in 1973, who was the right-wing Spanish politician.
Chechen violence has targeted individual officials and offices rather than civilians in an attempt to weaken the imperialist government they feel is holding them captive. What they've wanted for so many years is state independence, but they haven't been successful because Russia wants to use it as a border for preventing attacks from Asia.
ISIS wants their own state too, but they clearly target citizens.
Clearly, there are a variety of reasons that terrorist groups form, but it seems like the common theme is ethnic and regional nationalism. The ETA is a stateless nation fighting for a Basque state. The Chechens are fighting against Russia to establish an independent Islamic state, and ISIS is trying to establish a stronger and more present Islamic caliphate.
Throughout the 20th and 21st century, nationalism has become a very strong motif internationally. Some people fight for their country or nation through revolution and protest, as was the case in India, Algeria, or Mexico. Yet others fight through violence and attacking others to get a point across, as is the case with most of these terrorist groups.
This is all very intriguing. After some words from our sponsors, we will narrow in on more specific details.
Is your computer running slowly? Are your podcasts hard to edit? Like many Americans, your computer is probably having problems. Thankfully, for just 17 easy payments of $5.99, you could order our computer speeding up service at www.forneyspodcast.com to make your podcast easier.
Welcome back. Before the commercials, we were talking about the terrorist groups very broadly. I'm curious about ISIS in specific since we hear so much about them in world news. Do you guys have anything to say about them?
ISIS has many facets, and most people miss out on or misunderstand a lot of crucial information about them.
ISIS started in 2004 as an offset of Al-Qaeda, a Sunni terrorist group. In Iraq, they targeted the Shia-dominated government that followed Hussein.
Why were they targeting that government?
Hussein's government had a brutal regime that was dominated by Iraq's Sunni minority. The roles switched when Hussein's regime fell and the Shia took power. The Sunnis felt oppressed by the revenge-seeking Shia. Al-Qaeda fed off of the Sunnis' feeling of being oppressed and recruited militants to fight. Fast forward to October 2006 when an Al-Qaeda leader announced that the creation of an Islamic State in Iraq. Fast forward all the way to April 2013 when the Islamic State of Iraq absorbs a Syrian militant group and its leader begins calling his group ISIS. Since then, ISIS has taken control of cities like Mosul and Tikrit, and the leader has declared himself the authority over all the world's Muslims.
Who was this founder, and why did he break off of the original Al-Qaeda?
The founder of ISIS was Abu Musab Zarqawi. After being a member of al-Qaeda, he opted to take an even more conservative approach and became the leader of the Islamic State in Iraq that blended with the Syrian militant group. While al-Zarqawi's new group was originally dubbed the Islamic State of Iraq, or ISI, when the Syrian militant group was added, the name became ISIS. He died in 2006.
So if the founder of ISIS died, who's in charge now? What was his motivation for leading such a violent conquest?
Its current leader is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and he stays very under the radar, so it's hard for people to find information on him. He used to be a Muslim cleric since he came from a very religious background. In fact, he was so much of a zealot that he was known in his adolescence for chastising his relatives because they were not abiding by the strict codes of Sharia law.
But now, the main global power is more focused in places like Europe and the United States, instead of areas with a previously existing Islamic empire.
With empires like the Umayyad, Abbasid, and Ottoman, Islam has been a strong presence in the world for a long time. As you said, the Europeans and Americans have primarily taken control on the world stage, and now the Middle East and Africa are considered to be more developing regions. ISIS aims to regain past control by establishing another Islamic caliphate.
That makes a lot of sense, but how exactly are they trying to accomplish this goal? Does their funding come from Middle Eastern governments, or do they steal money and weapons?
What's unique about ISIS is how much money they make from oil revenue. They are one of the wealthiest terrorist groups in history, trading oil through shipments that move across Iraq and Turkey on the black market. Most people think ISIS gets their funding from the Saudi Arabian government, but this hasn't been proven and is much more likely that their funding comes from primarily oil.
When it first started out, ISIS was seed funded by wealthy donors in the Middle East. Now they gain revenue through their oil trade, kidnap ransoms, extortion, smuggling, and bank robberies. And they've managed to gain control of an area larger than the United Kingdom.
How do they end up getting weapons if they're a known terrorist network?
A lot of Western nations manufacture weapons and export them to state governments with the purpose of them being used by their respective militaries. A report from the Amnesty International has found that ISIS's current military arsenal is mostly made up of weapons and equipment that's been looted or illicitly traded from poorly secured military stocks in Iraq, which is sadly ironic because it means ISIS is using Western weapons to terrorize Western countries.
Yeah, and Amnesty International also blames the United States for their inability to deliver weapons to Iraq securely, because as a result, these weapons have been able to fall easily into ISIS hands.
Right now, the most common type of weapon used by ISIS fighters is the Russian-made AK automatic rifle and US-made military-issued M16s. They are also in possession of both US and Russian armored vehicles.
It sounds like they're really well equipped to take on these other powerful countries. Can you talk about what ISIS wants in their quest to establish an Islamic caliphate?
ISIS actions are all towards one purpose, creating an Islamic State. However, most people misconstrue this to mean establishing a theocracy throughout the region. What they really want is to return their civilization to a 7th century government, where the laws set forth are based entirely on early Islamic texts that were used only at its founding by the Prophet Muhammad and his earliest followers.
ISIS doesn't believe in borders or citizenship for their state, just Islam. They want to kill all disbelievers in the world. They actually feed off of religious hatred as they want Muslims to feel ostracized in the West, so they will join their jihadist network.
In fact, virtually every decision made by the top leaders of ISIS adheres to something called the prophetic methodology, which means that following the prophecy and legacy of Muhammad in exact detail. The Islamic State wants to purify the world by killing vast numbers of people. Even non-radical Muslims under ISIS rule are executed for being disbelievers, as Anna mentioned. They also want to purify the religion by eradicating all Shia Muslims. It is almost as if they want to travel back in time and revive the 7th century jizya tax, the global Quranic authority, and the absence of any state leaders electing to use man-made law over Sharia law.
In the words of the Prophet, a victorious band of warriors from my followers shall continue to fight for the truth. ISIS believes that they are, and only they are, the righteous followers of Muhammad, and that it is their responsibility to uphold the Quran to its exact and initial perfection.
They are also very against the ideology of their religious counterpart, which has been an ongoing battle for centuries. The founder of ISIS once said, "The danger from the Shia is greater and their damage worse and more destructive to the Islamic nation than the Americans."
The main issue with all these viewpoints is they belong in the past. In today's society, it is no longer acceptable to execute disbelievers or strictly follow law codes spelling out inhumane punishments for minor infractions. Because there is no room for growth, a lot of the standards that ISIS members have come to live by and fight for are guidelines outlined in the Quran and have been taken far too literally.
So, ISIS wants to create a future by using the past. Sounds like an apocalypse waiting to happen.
It is. ISIS wants to overcome the Shiite crescent in the Middle East and take its war to Europe and America, ultimately leading their Muslim followers into an apocalyptic battle against all disbelievers.
I'd imagine that's why ISIS is targeting Western nations as well as Muslim, Middle Eastern ones. Do any of you have any final thoughts about the issue of terrorism today?
It's really alarming to think about the kind of effect these groups can have on the world.
It's important to be conscious about how our actions can affect other regions so that we can work together in creating compromise and prevent these networks from forming.
At the very least, we would have a better chance of reacting in a way that doesn't strengthen their anger towards Western nations and prevents them from gaining support from these regions.
Thank you. And with that, we can bring this to a close. I definitely learned a lot more about the different terrorist groups and their ideas, backgrounds, and leadership. Let's hope that the world will be able to quell terrorism sometime in the near future.